It's an honest controversy. We are faced with a great moral dilemma. When you come to war of that scale, whichever course of action you decide on, there are moral problems. The reason for the bomber offensive was that in 1940, our army was defeated. The Navy was barely able to keep the Atlantic line open. You had to carry the war to Hitler. You absolutely had to stop him building up his military strength. And the bomber offensive was the only way. The sad thing was that we didn't have the equipment or the ability to hit precision targets. Therefore, we were thrown back onto area bombing. Dresden was a particular case which was most unfortunate. Nobody knew the defenses had been removed from Dresden. Therefore, 90% of the bombs fell on the target. And it was full of refugees. All of this combined to make it a moral disaster.
The Allied struggle was devoted to defeating an ideology that destroyed life as an end in itself. Nazism proposed a moral order that turned civilized values upside down. The extermination camps brought humanity face to face with the unthinkable. To fight it required a physical strategy of resistance. But it also required something more. Like all evils, it has to be understood. It compels us to readdress our understanding of the world, to comprehend the possibility of such evil. But how should we regard and deal with evil? The problem raised agonizing dilemmas for the fight against Hitler, just as it does for those facing evil today. Effective resistance against such evils as Nazism is, to many, possible only with force. But this approach entails risks. By retaliating with violence, as the Allies did over Dresden, the resistors can become tainted with the very evil they seek to overcome. And coming to terms with evil is no less difficult. Finding hope in a world filled with evil may seem to many to be unrealistic. So, how should we cope with evil? In this, the final program of the series, we reflect on the dilemmas raised by Nazism to discover whether and how we might confront evil. The central question in any strategy of resistance is, how can evil be overcome without the resistor becoming tainted in the process? Over 50 years ago, a nation of colonial subjects, inspired by a great political and religious leader, achieved a seemingly impossible dream. In India, in the last throes of colonial rule, the victors in every sense were the men who refused to take up the weapons of the aggressors. The more often they were beaten to the ground, the greater their moral integrity. It was this growing moral ascendancy which, in the end, helped to defeat the colonial power.
After about 73 hours, the city was reported as quiet, and Gandhi ended his fast. Here he is at the Maidan, the place appointed for a public prayer meeting.
Gandhi and his followers seem to have proved that oppression could be successfully resisted without generating further evil. But the final test of any strategy of resistance, including that of pacifism, is whether it could achieve its goals against the greatest evils that humanity has had to face. Paul Oestreicher is canon of Coventry Cathedral. As president of Amnesty International and an advisor to governments on terrorism, he has been fighting evil in its various forms. His determination springs directly from his experiences as a child who witnessed Nazi atrocities firsthand. Yet, for all his experience of combating evil, he remains a committed pacifist.
There is no better place than this cathedral ruin in which to face up to the dilemma that any pacifist has to take seriously. Hitler destroyed this cathedral in the Second World War. Could Hitler have been defeated with something less than that world war? Could the people of Europe have in some other way destroyed one of the most evil systems that the world has known? Hitler, after all, said to the British in India, all you have to do is shoot Gandhi and it will be all over and you'll win. Hitler certainly would have shot any leading people of a Gandhi type who were trying to conscientize, to educate the German people into that kind of resistance. The provost, you know, stood in this ruin the morning after the raid and actually said, we reject revenge and we embrace forgiveness. That somehow got to be the spiritual root of some new way of defeating the tyrants of our world. I think if the people of Europe had been ready to defeat Hitler non-violently, if there hadn't been so many collaborators in the countries he occupied, if there had been some Polish and some French and some Dutch Gandhis, then that system, over time, would have come crashing down. If Hitler had been beaten in that kind of way, we would probably have a less violent, a less divided, and a much more creatively healthy Europe than we have at present.
Because pacifism is determined not to add further evil to the world, it is a long and painstaking strategy. This can limit its effectiveness against evils that spread with relentless speed. In the last war, there were pacifists, but many of them felt compelled to review their stance against so remorseless an evil as Nazism. One of them was the legendary German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Reverend Ulrich Simon knew him in Berlin.
We are here in a South London church dedicated to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, where he was a pastor from 1933 to 1935. Bonhoeffer, unlike most of his contemporaries, had an instinctive anticipation of the viciousness of the Hitler regime. He was a pacifist, a man who loved peace. In fact, he could have preserved his life, and he knew that, because he happened to be in New York at the Union Seminary as a professor, with all the glittering prizes which were offered at that time. The most heroic and lasting impact of his life is to be found in 1939, when against all professional advice, he decided to return to Germany to dire peril. The inner struggle of that man can hardly be described except by those who've gone through it themselves. The realization which came to him and to some others that there is a kind of brutal force which can only be resisted and must be resisted, not only ideologically, but also with arms. This is something which, especially people who are in the Christian tradition, always find very difficult to defend and to engage in. The Bonhoeffer who returned to Germany was no longer a pacifist. He got away with an awful lot. And this enabled him to make contact with a variety of people who came to the conclusion that Hitler must be assassinated. Bonhoeffer did not carry arms, but he gave them, as it were, a moral alibi for what they were proposing to do.
In July 1944, a desperate attempt was organized to assassinate Hitler. Hitler was wounded, but survived.
He did come under grave suspicion, and he was arrested before the actual plot against Hitler took shape. Bonhoeffer's life came to an end in 1945 when the war was nearly over. He and many others were executed by hanging in Flossenburg. There's a description of his execution, his conduct, his prayers, and there's no doubt that he becomes for us the prototype of a person who becomes a conqueror in defeat, a victor indeed in the eternal struggle against evil. One might say that in the 20th century there have been quite a few people, an army in fact to which Bonhoeffer belongs, who continue in that marvelous tradition of victorious martyrdom.
In the Warsaw Ghetto, in its relatively early days, there was a kind of debate going on among the leadership, particularly the religious leadership of the ghetto, about resistance. But there was a rabbi in Warsaw, whose name was Lieberman, who argued, don't be passive in the face of evil. Well, that wasn't easy for everyone. But in that same Warsaw Ghetto, in the spring of 1943, the remnants of that ghetto, about 50,000 of them, revolted against the whole might of the German army. See, they already knew and they understood that the choice was really no longer between life and death, but between one kind of death and another kind of death. And so they took on the full might of the German army, and yes, they were ultimately destroyed, wiped out. I was once involved in that kind of a crazy dilemma. It was 1944. I was prisoner in a God-forsaken, awful little camp called Lieberosa in Silesia. And among our guards, the SS, one was particularly violent. He had the bizarre habit of taking his gun when no one of his superiors was looking, swing the gun above his head, and bring his butt down on wherever. A head, a shoulder, a leg. And once that happened to you, you were actually finished. They were lethal blows. And so, really in sheer desperation, a small group who were carrying food had him as their sole guard on a journey through this forest from the camp to the place of work. And we stopped, and he came close to see why, and it really wasn't difficult. We killed him. Looking back on it, I think we had both a moral and a physical responsibility to resist it, if need be, with violence. You see, passive resistance would have been absolutely no use in that desperate situation, because that was virtually opting them for death.
At Bergen-Belsen, British troops discovered the bodies of 12,000 victims still unburied. 13,000 lay dying.
Confronted with the desperate situation created by the Nazis, it is no surprise that the Allies too decided that only force of arms would liberate the innocent victims. But if the use of violence may be allowed, what are its limits? At what point does the violence of the defender begin to exacerbate the evil? In his book, Just and Unjust Wars, political theorist Michael Walzer has tried to define the limits of justifiable violence. A key example he takes is the Allied response to Nazism directed from bases like RAF Uxbridge.
The great dilemma about using violence to resist evil is that violence itself is evil. War is evil even when it's a necessary evil. In the West, a whole set of doctrines limiting the use of violence in war were worked out in the Middle Ages. This is called the doctrine of the just war. Its most important principles are, first, that war must only be fought for a just purpose, against aggression, in self-defense. And secondly, that violence must not be used against innocent men and women, against men and women not engaged in actual warfare. The Battle of Britain, a large part of which was directed from this room, the Operations Center of Number 11 Group Fighter Command, provides a nice illustration of the just war doctrine, a good starting point for our examination of the rules of justifiable violence. The function of the center was the defense of London and the southeast zones of England. From this complex, the critical engagements of the Battle of Britain were organized and directed. It's plain to see that the Battle of Britain was fought justly by the British. They were defending their country against an aggressive attack, but no innocent civilians were killed by the defenders. But the case gets much harder when we turn to examples in which people fighting just wars nevertheless put innocent civilians at risk and often kill them. In response to these difficulties, Catholic thinkers in the Middle Ages introduced the principle of double effect. This is based on a distinction between intended and unintended actions. An attack which may kill innocent civilians can be justified if the killing of non-combatants is unintended We can see how this double effect principle works in this high altitude attack on U-boats in Le Havre Harbor.
A number of direct hits were scored, and in one case the concrete roof was pierced to a considerable depth. 5 direct hits were scored on an adjoining naval school.
The intention was clearly to hit the U-boat and the naval quarters of the German ships. Innocent civilians may, in the course of the attack, also have been killed. But though foreseen, these deaths were no part of the military plan. There is an obvious problem with this argument. It can provide, and it has in fact provided, blanket justifications for devastating and immoral air attacks. The just war doctrine needs to be strengthened with what we might call a doctrine of double intention.
These attacks were made with great precision and invariably surprised the enemy by the speed and accuracy with which they were carried out.
You must not only intend the good effect of defeating the enemy, you must also intend to minimize the bad effect, the deaths of innocent civilians.
Mosquitoes attacked a chateau in the Brest Peninsula.
So precision bombing, which demands low altitude flying and therefore greater risks for the pilots, is more just because it minimizes civilian casualties.
The attack was made from minimum altitude, the aircraft literally placing their bombs on the buildings.
and rules of engagement help us to resist evil without adding to it. Mostly, soldiers take pride in living up to the rules of war.
Come back to the soil of England.
But sometimes they tell us that they can't live up to the rules without losing the battle, or even losing the war. Consider the situation in 1940. The British Army was defeated. Only the Air Force could carry the war to Hitler's Germany. At first, the RAF adopted a policy of daylight bombing, hoping to hit military and industrial targets. But accuracy was not all that great, even in daylight. And the losses suffered by the RAF squadrons were very, very high. So at a certain point, it became necessary to turn to bombing by night and to what was in effect area or carpet bombing.
74 Lancasters of Bomber Command attacked the port of Königsberg with high explosive and incendiaries. As a result of this attack, and one 3 nights later, 40% of the total built-up area was gutted by fire, and at least 44 warehouses were destroyed.
The policy finally adopted was a policy of terror bombing. Can a policy of that sort ever be justified? Well, it cannot be justified in terms of conventional just war doctrine. It overrides the rules of war because it makes a policy of killing innocent people. But there may be situations in human history when we are faced with an evil so great that we must do whatever is required to defeat that evil. One of the pilots flying for Bomber Command was Captain John Whiteley.
I think we've got to face the fact that we were dealing with a very, very evil man. And sometimes in that situation, you've got to produce something which is perhaps marginally less evil. I mean, war is evil. And all right, people will argue that the bomb offensive was evil. Perhaps it was. But what was the alternative? No one has told me what we could have done between 1940 and 1944.
Mankind faced a supreme emergency in 1940. At such a time, perhaps one can override the rules of war, recognizing that that's what one is doing. Overriding the rules of war, not denying their existence, not pretending that the people who are being killed are not innocent people. They are innocent people, even if they are enemy civilians. By 1942, the prospect of an imminent Nazi triumph in Europe had passed. And yet the terror raids continued. Essen, Berlin, Hamburg. And finally, in the spring of 1945, when the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, 100,000 men and women were brutally killed in Dresden. Now it was a question not of winning, but of how fast and at what price a victory might be achieved.
I think that a mistake was made at the end of 1944. It was no longer necessary to bomb cities. But the trouble is, when you're in a life and death struggle, now this is my point, every single day, if you average it out, 10,000 people were being exterminated in Hitler's concentration camps. Now, if you're faced with that, you've got to act, and you've got to take the steps that will bring it to the war to an end in the quickest way and with the minimum loss of life. The longer it went on, the greater the casualties. But of course, it was such a desperate struggle, inevitably you make mistakes. And the bomber offensive, having gained its momentum, this is one of the dilemmas of war. You start something, it carries its own momentum. You can't stop it. And I don't believe bombing of cities was necessary by the end of 1944.
A consensus seems to have emerged that the last great raids of the European war, and particularly the Dresden raid, were morally wrong. But another example, one which is contested bitterly, and that is the American use of an atomic bomb over Hiroshima, and then another over Nagasaki.
Well, the Japs asked for trouble, and they're getting it. Atomic bombs included. But if we or our allies allow the Japanese criminals to escape the punishment they so justly deserve, that itself will be a crime. Our men will have fought in vain, and war will inevitably return.
Were there circumstances sufficiently extreme to justify overriding the rules of war in this dramatic way with a new and previously unused weapon?
When we come to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it may be thought that I'm biased because I was one of the 2 British observers present. But it meant that I did know the factors that went into the decision to drop. In August 1945, Japan was obviously defeated. But they thought that the greatest disgrace was surrender. You could not surrender. They were determined to fight to the last inch of Japanese soil.
Then the assault. The Japs ashore had had the hell of a pounding, but they still fought back, and the invasion craft were met with shell fire as they closed the beaches.
So the alternative was the all-out invasion of Japan across the whole Pacific, and there were plans for 5 million men to go in. Or the hope that the 2 atom bombs would shock them into giving up. Now, this was, there was heart-searching over this, because they could see the political consequences of dropping an atom bomb. But in my view, if you have the alternative of the all-out invasion with the probability of 5 million deaths, and most of them civilian, or the atom bomb, which at the highest estimate, the 2 of them took 250,000 against 5 or 6 million. I cannot see, whatever you may think about the morality of the atom bomb, how you can morally justify the all-out offensive.
The arguments in favor of using the bomb are also arguments against the realism of a negotiating posture. But in fact, we never adopted a negotiating posture.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
And it seems to me that the Americans owed to the Japanese, before killing those who were killed, an effort to save those who could be saved in another way, perhaps with a demonstrative use of the bomb on an uninhabited island, perhaps with an effort to negotiate a settlement short of unconditional surrender. These were not Nazis. This was a country engaged in a more traditional kind of aggression and imperial expansion. And what was necessary was to reach an agreement that would end the fighting.
The dilemmas raised when resisting a vast evil are in many ways no different when the evil is local and threatening few victims only. Within carefully applied rules, and when necessary, what Michael Walzer called the evil of violence may be justified. But physical resistance is only part of the struggle. There's another battle to be fought. Many people, not only the survivors of the Nazis, have tried to make sense of a life in which such evil could be permitted. But is an understanding achievable? Evil can strike a shattering blow to our outlook on the world. To repair the damage demands a spiritual vision that makes sense of the random pain and suffering we see around us. The most developed source of such understanding has often been provided by religion. In every religious tradition, people have focused their outrage and their incomprehension of evil onto malevolent, supernatural beings who wreak havoc on man and the world. To this day, personifying evil in this manner remains one way of coming to terms with evil. But for many believers, this solution evades the central issue. And for Christians, the difficulty is particularly acute. If there is a good and omnipotent God, why does he allow evil to upset his creation? The theologian John Hick considers this the critical question.
The standard Christian answer is the one put forward by St. Augustine in the 4th century. In essence, Augustine argued that God, in all goodness, originally created a perfect humanity. This meant giving us not only moral perfection, but also free will. And genuine free will does involve the possibility that human beings will disobey God. As it happened, they did disobey God. The consequences were devastating. Humanity fell from grace, and henceforth men and women have been born with a natural inclination to evil in a world full of misery, unhappiness, and suffering. Augustine's basic motive was to take the responsibility for evil away from the Creator and lay it firmly on the creatures. But a contradiction lurks at the heart of the picture he offers. For if the beings whom God made freely went wrong, there must have been a flaw in their nature, and their Creator must bear the ultimate responsibility for it. There is another strand of Christian thought, going back to some of the earliest of the Church's theologians, which has been revived in modern times, and to my mind, it avoids the pitfalls of St. Augustine's approach. It accepts God's ultimate responsibility for the creation. It sees the human species as having been brought into existence not as perfect beings who then fell into sin, but as immature beings capable of growing through their own freedom into the persons whom God is seeking to create. And it sees our world as an environment in which imperfect creatures can begin to grow towards their future perfection. So I think we should get away from the idea of God as like an architect planning a building, like this library, and naturally wanting to make it as convenient and comfortable as possible and as free as possible from danger and accident. If God was trying to create a hazard-free world, the plan has obviously failed badly. This library may be an architectural success, but the world is no pain-free paradise and never has been. But perhaps God has had a rather different purpose in mind. Perhaps God's intention was to make an environment in which we human beings, as intelligent animals who are at the same time morally and spiritually immature, may gradually be fashioned through our own free responses into adult children of God. Imagine a paradise so designed that there are no possibilities of pain and suffering. If you try to kill someone, they're not injured. If you cheat, no one suffers. In such a world, it would be impossible to act wrongly. And by the same token, it would be impossible to act rightly. And so, perhaps the world's natural dangers, along with our freedom to cheat, exploit, and murder, as well as to love and support one another, are the cost of the eventual creation of perfected persons. But I must stress that word eventual, for the creative process is obviously not completed in this present life, and indeed does not always even make progress in this life. And so it is essential to any serious Christian interpretation of our total situation to affirm that the person-making process continues beyond the mysterious boundary of death.
Such theological answers can help to make sense of pain and suffering, and this understanding can be a support in coming to terms with evil. Yet many will challenge such a view. Isn't the price paid for spiritual growth too high? In the late 19th century, Fyodor Dostoevsky dramatized this question in his classic novel, The Brothers Karamazov. In a central debate, Ivan Karamazov expresses his outrage about God's grand scheme to his brother Alyosha. "I accept," says Ivan, "that in the world's finale something so precious will happen that it will atone for all men's cruelty, all the blood they have shed."
That has been shed. Why are you telling me all this, Ivan? A father and mother of good education and breeding hated their little 5-year-old daughter. This poor little 5-year-old girl was subjected to all kinds of torture by those educated parents. They beat her, birched her, kicked her without themselves knowing why, until her body was covered with bruises. At last, they reached the height of their refinement. They shut her up all night in the cold and frost in the privy. And because she wouldn't ask to get up at night, as though a child of 5 sleeping its angelic, sound sleep could be trained at her age to ask for such a thing, they smeared her face with excrement and made her eat it. And it was her mother who made her. And her mother could sleep at night, hearing the groans of that poor child locked up in that vile place. Do you realize what it means when a poor little creature like that, who is quite unable to understand what is happening to her, beats her breast in that vile place, in the cold and dark, with her tiny fist, and weeps gentle, unresentful, searing tears to her dear, kind God to protect her? Can you understand why all this vile and horrid business is possible and should come to pass? They tell me that without it, man could not have even existed on earth, for without it, he would not have known good and evil. But why must we know that confounded good and evil when it costs so much? Answer me. Imagine that it is you yourself who are to erect the edifice of human destiny with the aim of making men happy in the end, of bringing about peace and contentment at last. But to do that, it is absolutely necessary, and indeed quite inevitable, to torture to death one poor soul, that little girl who beat her breast with her tiny fist, and to found the edifice on her unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on such conditions? Answer me, and do not lie. No. I wouldn't.
Ivan's outrage must be shared by most who witness the kind of evil he describes. The price paid for spiritual growth does seem too high. Can religion respond to the fact that it is always the innocent who suffer, and seem to suffer pointlessly? In 1986, Elie Wiesel, a novelist and survivor of the Holocaust, won the Nobel Prize for Peace. Much of his writing, for which he was honored, investigates the meaning of human suffering. In one book, Night, he recounts a childhood experience in Auschwitz.
One day, when we came back from work, we saw 3 gallows rearing up in the assembly place. 3 black crows, 3 victims in chains, and one of them a little servant, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more disturbed than usual. To hang a young boy in front of thousands of spectators was no light matter. The 3 victims mounted together onto the chairs. "Long live liberty," cried the 2 adults. But the child was silent. "Where is God? Where is he?" someone behind me asked. At a sign from the head of the camp, the 3 chairs tipped over. Total silence throughout the camp. Then the march past began. The 2 adults were no longer alive. Their tongues hung swollen, blue-tinged. But the 3rd rope was still moving. Being so light, the child was still alive. For more than half an hour he stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. And we had to look him full in the face. He was still alive when I passed in front of him. His tongue was still red. His eyes were not yet glazed. Behind me I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" And I heard a voice within me answer him, "Where is he? Here he is. He is hanging here, on this gallows." That night, the soup tasted of corpses.
What is Wiesel saying? The overpowering message of his story is that God is hanged with the prisoners. But what does he mean by that? For some, Wiesel's insight is a breakthrough for a religious account of evil in the world. God's apparent indifference to suffering in earlier views is changed. Now he participates with the innocent in their pain, and so becomes a sturdier support in the face of evil. Some Christians even find hope in this tale of the death of God. They see his death as part of his fight against evil. His ultimate victory is symbolized by the story of the resurrection. For many other people, however, God has literally died, killed by evil. Night has descended. For them, the reality of evil allows only for an atheistic view of the world. This is the view to which the German poet Erich Fried has come. His father was murdered by the Nazis. For him, all meaning must be found in this world. An important component of that, for victims of evil, is the hope that their suffering will be avenged.
I think we can see the expressions of this attitude whenever Nazi criminals like the Nuremberg war criminals or Adolf Eichmann are brought to justice. For those victims of evil already dead, it may be a fulfillment of their hopes. But bringing them to justice also sets a precedent so that future victims of evil can entertain realistic hopes that their death will not be forgotten. It is, of course, a difficult strategy to sustain, because there's a thin line between justice and retribution.
At this moment, the last possible, Dr. Savasius rose and said, "Before the accused pleads guilty or not guilty, I wish to voice two reservations. They are the suspicion of prejudice and the lack of authority of this court."
Some of these surviving Nazi criminals were executed under a law that was passed only after the crime had been committed. As a result, attempts to bring a criminal to justice can begin to undermine our very own rules of justice, thus almost tainting us with the very evil we want to overcome.
Rien ne distinguait la chambre à gaz d'un bloc ordinaire. À l'intérieur, une salle de douche pause accueillait les nouveaux venus.
We have to acknowledge that despair may be the only credible response. We have to admit to the possibility of no consolation, of not being able to come to terms with evil.
On fermait les portes. On observait.
Confronted with death in the gas chamber, despair would be a very appropriate response.
Le seul signe, mais il faut le savoir, c'est ce plafond labouré par les ongles. Même le béton se déchirait.
I can perhaps only try to be honest to myself and face my own despair. I have written a poem which I think deals with it. It's called Prayer at Night. Model within us, or of us, in which we still find some meaning. Help us so that we neither intone nor echo the false doctrines of the electronic brains and of their masters and servants, where injustice excels us in knowledge and resources, where injustice excels us in endurance and success, where injustice becomes so great that we shrink at its glance. Help us not to despair. When injustice invades us in our days and nights, in our startled waking and in our dreams, in our hopes and in our curses, help us not to forget ourselves. And if we do despair, help us to see that we are desperate. And if we do become bitter, help us to see that we are becoming bitter. And if we shrink with fear, help us to know that it is fear, despair and bitterness and fear, so that we do not fall into the error of thinking we have had a new revelation and found the great way out or the way in, and that alone had changed us.